Okay, well, today is February 21st, right? 2018. Feels like about May 21st outside. Praise God for that. We're continuing the series, Christianity on Trial, Does It Pass the Test? We're going to start with some questions tonight, provided that people have questions tonight. So let's start there. Who has a question? I'll ask one. We call this filibustering on campus when this happens, right? It's like, okay, so often, I was on campus last week, and a student asked me, doesn't it take too much faith to believe in God? And so I pointed out to the student that you have faith too. You have faith in a naturalistic system. So that's what we started looking at last week, right? Just put up your hand if you have a question. If not, we can just launch right in. I was showing a couple of video clips from campus. If you haven't checked out the Tom the Preacher site on Facebook, check that out. Tom the Preacher, it'll come up, Tom Short, public figure, or if you just type in Tom the Preacher, it will take you to the same Facebook site. And what we do on that site is we do live stream videos. We do live feeds from campus. Usually when Tom is preaching, sometimes you'll see me on there, but the clip I was showing, right as everyone was coming in tonight, I had a student at the University of Florida last November, and the student says to me, he just launches right in, I'm answering some questions for some other students, and he just comes in and he starts blasting me. He says, "Get off my campus, you creationist scum." Right? What a welcoming way to introduce myself to campus. But, so here's what he says. He says, "Don't you know that this debate has been settled? This is settled science. There's been no debate about evolution. There's been no debate about creation for well over 100 years now. Kind of like, what are you doing here?" And he's obviously pretty heated in the process. Okay, and the reason I bring that up is because that comes up a lot. This presupposition, this assumption that evolution is proved beyond any shadow of a doubt. And as we're going to see tonight, a person can mean a lot of different things by evolution. You can mean like 7 different things by biological evolution. So one of the things that you have to respond with is, okay, well, let's make sure we're not mixing up our terms here. You say evolution is settled science, all right? Tell me what you mean by evolution and why you think it's settled science, right? So you can go into a conversation there. So unfortunately, with this young man, I wasn't able to get there. But there was another guy who was sort of an agnostic Roman Catholic who came to UF and started kind of losing his faith. But he and I, for the last half an hour, at that point in time, had been having a respectful dialogue. And fortunately for me, I barely had to respond to the angry guy who wanted me to get off of his campus. I hardly had to say anything because the other guy, who was actually debating with me in a very kind way, jumped to my defense. And he says, "Hey, if you have a question, we were having a conversation. We've been having a great conversation. We don't agree. But, phrase what you're saying, ask a question." And so that was kind of interesting. All right, any questions? Anything come to mind yet before we get started? Or we started last week? Okay, I want to jump back in for time's sake, and hopefully we can get most of the way done with this lecture tonight. What I made a big mistake, and since last week, it seems like I've been out of the classroom for so long now that I've forgotten how to teach. I'm pretty good at impromptu preaching and apologetics on the spot. But I've realized, and I knew this while I was doing it, this is way too PowerPoint laden, and I knew that. I knew that from day one. I have too many PowerPoints, I have too many slides, slides have too many words, and so what I've done in this lecture, I've scaled it back to a more manageable level, something I'm used to teaching. I don't like using PowerPoint, but I think it helps. People like it on that end typically. My philosophy, when I first started teaching at the University of Georgia in 2004, for a 20-minute lecture, I would have like 50 PowerPoint slides, and I would just read them. And after I got more and more experience, the slides got fewer and fewer. I could go through 50 slides in 20 minutes starting out. The last year of teaching, after a decade of teaching, it would take me about 50 lectures to get through about the same amount of slides, so things slow down a lot. So just a summary here, I came across this quote and I wanted to throw it out there just to get things started. Malcolm Muggeridge, if you listen to Ravi Zacharias a lot, he's in the habit of quoting Malcolm Muggeridge, and I think he passed away a few decades ago. Here's his quote: "At the end of Christendom, I myself am convinced that the theory of evolution, especially the extent to which it's been applied, will be one of the great jokes in the history books in the future. Posterity will marvel that so very flimsy and dubious an hypothesis could be accepted with the incredible credulity that it has." You know, and I get behind that, because people do accept it hook, line, and sinker with great credulity. It's introduced, it kind of sneaks in under the radar. Evolutionary teaching to preschoolers when they're watching PBS, you know, and they're already setting the stage for them to buy into this Darwinian meta-narrative. Now, they're not going to be talking about mutations and natural selection, but they get them used to the idea of billions of years for the Earth, and gradual evolution. And so by the time they get to school, you know, they're ready for the next stage of indoctrination. And I'm convinced that the main reason why the majority of people who believe in evolution believe in it is not because of sound scientific critique, it's because they've been cultured into that. It's just an idea that they've never really examined closely to see if it meets good standards of evidence or proof, if it's coherent, and they just make assumptions. Well, my teachers believe it, they're smart people. My professors believe it, they're smart people. Blank percent of American Academy of Sciences professors and researchers believe in evolution, so well, I should too. It's a really lousy reason to believe in something, but unfortunately so many people do. You know, so often faith gets critiqued, and people say, well, you just believe that because your parents told you that. You just believe that because your pastor tells you that. And, you know, that can be actually a good caution, right? Because that can happen. And it doesn't mean it's wrong because our pastor or our parents told us, but we should go check the evidence for ourselves, right? But the same thing applies to them. How often do people believe in evolution because Richard Dawkins told them to, or because their biology professor told them to, right? Or their high school biology teacher told them to? They've never really checked both sides of it for themselves. Okay, so I just jump back down here. Here's where we left off. What Darwin got right. So we were talking about selection. And actually there are 3 different types of selection in change across generation, adaptation. We're okay with adaptation, by the way. Nothing against adaptation. In fact, if you believe that an all-wise, all-knowing God created the heavens and the earth, right, and created a variety of species, knowing that the environment was going to change a little bit every now and then, knowing that these species were going to gravitate to all corners of the globe and have to adjust to their environments, then what you would say is, well, an all-wise, all-knowing creator is going to build within them the capacity to become fine-tuned to their environments. That just makes sense. So biblical creationists, we have no problem with adaptation. In fact, we're going to talk about 3 types of selection. We don't have a problem with any of these. But the problem is, selection is not Darwinian evolution. Those are very different monsters, okay? So we're going to take a look at these. What are the 3 types of selection? I think these are on the new notes that I gave you. Artificial selection, natural selection, and sexual selection. Artificial, natural, and sexual. And so I think we did this last week. We talked about the domestication of dogs, right? And how from basically gray wolves through selective breeding, we've gotten this huge variety of canines. Anything from a Pekingese to a Great Dane. Morphologically very different creatures, but they're exactly the same species. In the gray wolf genome, there's all of that variety in the genome. You don't see it expressed all the time, but it's there. And selection, humans saying, okay, we want to create some new types of dogs by selective breeding, can entice the genome to manifest what are called phenotypes. Those characteristics are brought out, either for smaller dogs or for bigger dogs, right? You do that through breeding, through a certain color dog, through certain facial shapes, right? All of that information is pre-packaged in the genome, and it's unlocked intentionally by design through artificial selection. Does that kind of make sense? And so, in fact, Darwin actually starts his reasoning there and says, well, you know, there's all this variety among dogs. What if nature were to do something similar to what humans do when they engage in selective breeding of animals? And so this is where he comes up with the idea of natural selection. As we saw last week, it wasn't really his idea. He kind of, at least it had been around for a while. His grandfather talked about natural selection. He just didn't call it that. And so what Charles Darwin is most specifically credited with is not evolution per se. It's not even natural selection per se. It's identifying natural selection as being the main driving mechanism of speciation, new species coming into existence over time, radical changes across generations that get us to entirely different kinds of animals over thousands or millions of years, okay? So with, I think we have a few slides down. So his breakthrough, you know, the HMS Beagle, Darwin spent several years touring the world on the HMS Beagle. And probably the most noteworthy place that he stopped was the Galapagos Islands. I gave you a map, right? I was going to quiz you. Where are the Galapagos?
Off of South America.
Basically, you just go south, right? It's right up there. Basically, if you went like straight south from here, maybe it's slightly west. You know, if you went straight south from here, you would entirely miss South America. Do you realize that? I used to ask my students that. If you went directly south, what would be the first ocean that you crossed into? And they would all say Atlantic. And I'd be like, no, it's the Pacific. Believe it or not, because South America's offset, right? So pretty much if you went straight south from there, you can see a little bit of Florida up there. If you went straight south, you'd be in the region of the Galapagos. It's as the crow flies, not that crows can fly that far until they evolve some more, but you would be in the Galapagos Islands. So it's I can't say the word, archipelago, somebody help me out with that. It's a conglomeration like Hawaii of islands. They're relatively close, but of course they're geographically isolated, okay? And so on the Galapagos, Darwin noticed some really peculiar animals. For example, the giant tortoises, right? These huge tortoises that live I think over 200 years, they can live that long. And probably the single animal that he's most noted for, of course, was what? The finches, right? That's very interesting too, because Charles Darwin had precious little to say about these finches. This is mostly something that was written into the Darwinian narrative after the fact. But it's true, he did make observations of finches. He took finches back. I don't know what he put them in because they didn't have Ziploc bags back then or refrigeration. But the finches went with him eventually back to England, and he handed his finches over to a friend who was an ornithologist. You guys know what an ornithologist is? That's not the guy who straightens out your teeth. That's orthodontist. But an ornithologist is a person who studies birds. And Darwin thought that these were different species of birds, so the story goes, but his ornithologist friend says, no, they're all very closely related finches. But of course, there's some radical differences in the beaks. And so what Darwin says is due to, I'll go back a slide here, due to the geographic isolation of these islands, you find one type of finch on one island, slightly different type of finch on another island, and this is supposed to be evidence of evolution from a common ancestor. Okay? And in fact, it might be, but I wouldn't call it evolution. That would just be more of an example of selection. And so the idea with the birds is the main thing that's focused on are their beaks. Different beaks are used to obtain different types of food. And I forget exactly how it goes, but like the long skinny beaks are good for digging out insects, or if they're getting nutrition from flowers, they can put their long beaks in there and suck out the nectar or whatnot, kind of like a hummingbird. This guy right here would be able to crack nuts better because it has like a heavy-duty beak that can really apply a lot of pressure. And so the idea is, depending on vegetation, depending on whether it's an arid environment or a moist environment, different types of vegetation grow, you're going to have different types of beaks. All right. So between Darwin's finches and then the peppered moths, have you guys heard of the peppered moths before? Which Darwin didn't observe. These seem to be like the main fare up front for convincing people that Darwinian evolution has like a bunch of evidence to support it. So Darwin got natural selection right, that happens. He got artificial selection right, of course that happens. He also got sexual, I don't have a lot of them, he has sexual selection right too. And in fact, Darwin said more later in his life about sexual selection than he did natural selection. And the idea of sexual selection is that usually females in nature they apply selection criteria to determine which males to mate with, okay? So there is an intelligence, in fact, even the most ardent atheistic evolutionist would admit that there is an element of a semi-intelligent selection process going on. But that intelligence factor is the female, using her intelligence to weigh out the characteristics of the males and to determine which males to breed with and which males not to breed with. Okay, that's the idea of sexual selection. So for example, you guys have seen the elk stags with the humongous antlers before. Their antlers can be like almost as long as their bodies. Well, what are those antlers there for? Somebody just asked you, why do those elk have such? You can say it's to glorify God, right? That's not a bad answer. I would agree with you. But functionally, what purpose biologically do those antlers serve?
For fighting.
Yeah, so that would have been my first guess. They're there for combat because the males spar, and that sparring has a lot to do with demonstrating which one is the most fit, right? And that there is truth in that. But the idea of sexual selection is the reason why they got so big. They were smaller. They used to serve the purpose of combat. Now, why have they gotten so ridiculously big? Almost to the point of being an encumbrance, it's because the females started selecting which males to mate with based upon how big and how lavish their antlers are. You kind of get the idea? And so the female selects a male with slightly bigger antlers, and then the genes for females that select males with bigger antlers and males with bigger antlers show up in the next generation. You have this ratcheting up, right? Selection for big antlers. Probably the classic example of that is what? It's not elk, by the way. It's a bird. I'll give you a hint. It's not finches.
Chicken.
Close. I think somebody said it. The peacock. The peacock's tail, right? You ever seen how the males and the females interact? The males will strut up to the females and will kind of like, they'll follow the female around, just like, look what I've got. And so this is how the females select which males to copulate. Let's be nice to mate with, right, and reproduce with. Well, Darwin had that right too. That does happen. That is a real phenomenon. There's no reason why a biblical creationist would have to say that, okay, sexual selection is not a thing. Clearly it is among humans. Our females apply criteria to males when they decide who to marry, right? They do that. And we just accept that as part of human nature. That's in the Bible, actually. So there's no reason why we have to, nothing in the theory of selection, whether it's artificial, natural, or sexual, that is at odds with anything in biblical creation. This is just the way the Creator set up the system. Okay, and the system works really well. Okay, Questions on any of that so far? Just want to make sure I haven't been pausing enough to ask some questions along the way. But just, anytime you want to throw up your hand, that's fine. We can pause and do a question or two. All right, so what did Darwin get wrong? He got selection right. We don't have any problem with selection. What did he get wrong? Well, he got wrong the whole origin of species thing, which, is a big deal considering his book is called On the Origin of Species. The full title again, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, the preservation of preferred races in the struggle for life. Next class, we'll talk about some of the societal implications of people picking up on Darwinian ideas and applying them to human society, right? And probably the worst case scenario there was this was a huge contributor, in point of fact, to the Holocaust. So Darwin gets this completely wrong. And what you're going to see on this slide, on the left, this is a picture of Darwin's original sketch. And right there, if you can't make it out on top, it says, "I think," and he draws this branching phenomenon. And so this is where Darwin hatches the idea of common ancestry. Not just common ancestry, he goes way beyond that, as do modern-day evolutionists. He goes way beyond that to universal common ancestry. And those are very different things, common ancestry and universal common ancestry. Those finches that we looked at, they may have had a common ancestor. Going back to the ark, they probably did, right? But they don't have a universal common ancestor. Universal common ancestry would say that you and I are related to those finches if you go far enough back, right? A coconut tree is related to both you and me and those finches if you go far enough back. That's universal common ancestry. And so you have Darwin's sketch on the left. On the right, I know it's kind of small, apologize for that, but you see a graphic depiction of this idea of universal common ancestry. At the very bottom, you see representations of unicellular organisms, like bacteria, microscopic guys, okay? And then everything starts progressing. Obviously, some species stay bacteria, but you also have this ratcheting up of complexity. At some point, you get multicellular life. You get worms, okay? From the worms, you get fish. Millions, billions of years later, you get fish. From fish, you get amphibians. From amphibians, you get reptiles. You get really big reptiles called dinosaurs, right? From dinosaurs, you get birds. That's the main evolutionary theory, that modern birds are descendants of dinosaurs. Problem with that is even according to their own data, they found birds that are as old or even older than some of the dinosaurs. So that throws a little monkey wrench into their whole theory. They don't like to talk about that a whole lot. At some point, reptiles, at least a certain species of reptile, transitioned into mammals, these tiny little mammals that lived in the rocks, right, warm-blooded guys. And from the mammals, you get, at least in one of these lines, you get basically monkeys, for lack of a better term. And then from the monkey species, working our way up, you get apes, you get the great apes, and then humans. We're just another great ape species, just another branch on that evolutionary limb. So that is universal common ancestry. That's what Darwin was shooting for. That's what people have bought into hook, line, and sinker. That's what's taught in public middle schools, public high schools, public universities. Not just finches came from a common finch ancestor, but universal common ancestry. You can trace everything back billions of years ago to microscopic organisms that lived in the ocean. Okay, and all life has proceeded forth from this common ancestor, whatever it was. Is that scientific? Do they have demonstrable evidence of that, or is it a narrative that they're committed to? The answer is the latter. Obviously, it's not demonstrable. We're not in the realm of science here. We're not in the realm of methodological science. We're in the realm of speculation and projection and extrapolation of data. Okay? Moving on. So this is how Darwin closes 1859 on the origin of species. I believe this is in fact the last paragraph. And I highlighted the opening there. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one universal common ancestry. Right there. And that whilst this planet has going on cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. Did this go out?
Yeah.
Do we need it? I mean,
Yes.
okay.
Video especially.
Do you want me to keep teaching, or?
You want your batteries up? Yes, they are coming down.
I'm used to projecting my voice, but...
No, it helps. It helps a lot to have.
All right. And so, can I go ahead until we get it?
Sure.
Keep on? Okay. So I wanted to cue you in there on there is grandeur in this view of life, because I kind of take issue with that. To me, it's a very dismal view of life. I don't agree. I think Darwin is being contentious on purpose there. I don't get the grandeur. And to illustrate, on the next slide, I'm going to show you an artistic rendition of our supposed common mammal ancestor. You and a squirrel, you and a fox, you and a deer, you and a blue whale, you and a bat have a common ancestor if you go far enough back. You want to see what it looks like? What's this guy right here? I kid you not. I don't know what this thing was called. You could look it up. Put like first common ancestor mammal. It looks kind of like halfway between a possum and a rat and a badger, I guess. But this is supposed to be it. Our common mammalian ancestor. And I think that one's a little more funny. Here's another one. If you go to the If you go up to Washington, D.C. and go to the Natural History Museum, you'll see this guy on display. The one they have looks more like that. Okay, and they'll talk about how many millions of years ago, I think it was something like 70 or 80 million years ago, they find fossils of this guy, and this is the common ancestor for all mammals. So yes, again, just to reiterate, anything from bats to dolphins, right, to blue whales to horses, all came from this guy, roughly 70 or 80 million years ago. And that's science, right? You can't question it because it's science. You're supposed to believe it. And if you question it, you're just a religious fundamentalist, right? With an agenda. All right. So what is evolution? Let's turn our attention to this question. We talked about selection. We talked about universal common ancestry. What is evolution? And as I mentioned at the beginning of class, I could give you lots of different definitions. This is one of the reasons why this discussion can get so confused. Because the evolutionists, they'll say, evolution is a fact. It's not just a theory, it's a fact. Okay, well, what is your evidence? What do you mean by it's a fact? And they'll say, well, for example, antibiotic resistance. Don't you know, people have been using that triclosan-laced antibacterial soap for so long, right, that it's induced certain strains of bacteria to develop a resistance to the antibiotics. And do you believe in that? And I say, of course I believe in that. Well, then you believe in evolution. I'm like, no, I don't believe in it the way that you do. We're talking about two different things. Or they'll say, what about genetic engineers? We won't get into a discussion of GMOs, but with the idea of GMOs, engineering new types of vegetables, let's say, and they'll say, don't you know that genetic engineering has created this new type of apple tree or this new type of corn, and it's its own new species of corn. So we've observed speciation. This type of corn became a new type of corn. And I'm like, okay, do you believe in that? Sure, why would I not believe in that? Obviously that happens. Well, then you believe in evolution. No, I don't. Not in the same way you do. You started with corn, you ended with corn. You started with bacteria, you ended with bacteria. Okay, what you would need to demonstrate is some major ratcheting up of complexity, some completely new kind of organism coming from a common ancestor. That's what you need to demonstrate, and there is no scientific evidence of that. Okay. I was reading earlier today, and maybe some of you have seen it, the longest scientific experiment with genetic modification. It's being conducted with E. coli. Okay, sounds like a real fun research project, right? Make sure you have a couple of layers of gloves on. You don't want that getting into your gut, obviously. But these researchers started in 1988. And they started, E. coli replicates, obviously, very quickly, like multiple times a day. And so what they've done is they've created an environment that would maximize both mutation and selective pressure. So if you could get evolution of bacteria, you should clearly get that it was set up deliberately to cause mutations, to cause adaptations. And guess what they found? Over literally hundreds of thousands of replication cycles of these E. coli bacteria. You start with E. coli bacteria, you still got E. coli bacteria. They're maybe a little bit bigger, maybe they utilize glucose slightly differently, but they're the same thing. All we're seeing is adaptation. We're not seeing any evolution, okay? So again, if a person asks you if you believe in evolution, my first question back to them would be, well, what specifically do you mean by evolution? Right? What specifically do you mean? And if they say antibiotic resistance, I have no problem with that. Do you mean anything else by evolution? And try to get them to admit that they're talking about universal common ancestry. And they believe that's scientific, and they think you should believe it's scientific. At which point you can feel very comfortable pushing back and saying, no, I don't accept that. The scientific evidence doesn't bear it out. Okay, I understand that that's your belief. You have faith in that process. You have faith in that narrative. But I have faith in God who created kinds of animals. They can adapt. They can change a little bit. We're going to look at that in a minute. But they're basically fixed. The kinds are basically fixed. Birds are birds. Reptiles are reptiles. Okay? Fish are fish. So really the idea here is evidence and extrapolation. And I played with my fonts deliberately because I was trying to crunch up that evidence, right, to a very restricted range. So looking at this little tiny slither of evidence, the evolutionist, the Darwinian, makes these wild extrapolations from that. And they're going to fill that up with their narrative. Okay? Not the most artistic picture in the world, but it does kind of illustrate the point. You'll hear people say, if you believe in microevolution, then you must believe in macroevolution. After all, it's the same process. Microevolution, plus microevolution gets us to macroevolution, these big, major evolutionary changes. Okay, so they're putting that forth as a scientific statement. And again, feel free to push back and say, no, I don't buy it. Why not? Because the evidence doesn't demonstrate it. Or make them make their case. Say, okay, well, if that's your contention, show me the compelling case that you can make with the available scientific evidence that would convince me, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that that has happened. And if not, then I'm going to be reluctant to affirm your theory or your hypothesis. So I know we're kind of reiterating, but the idea of microevolution, basically relatively small changes. Dogs are basically dogs. Now, okay, you get into a discussion of what is meant by the biblical word kind. Did that come up last week? What did the Hebrew authors, what did Moses mean? He said God created animals according to their kinds. And the answer to that is we don't know exactly. We don't know exactly what specific boundary God set for kinds. Does that correspond exactly to what we would call a species today? Probably not. Okay, it's a little broader than that. More like the genus or even the family level. Okay, again, what you see here depicted on the right are dogs, cats are cats. Your house cat is the same kind of animal as an African lion. Okay, they're both cats, and we call them that. we talk about the big cats, the great cats, and the small cats, right? What we're doing is we're recognizing these are the same type of animal. Sharks are one type of fish, so are bats, right? They're the same kind, they're fish. Whereas macroevolution there on the left is kind of the scenario that I depicted earlier. From the goo to you via the zoo, right? You can see our little friend, he looks more like a weasel here though, our common ancestor. All right. So here's a good metaphor or word picture. Who knows the directions around here? Let me think for a second. Is that north?
Yeah,
Roughly north, south. What I'm looking for is east and west.
no, it's east and west.
This is
South and north.
that's west, okay. All right, so what am I doing right now?
East. Going west.
No, I'm walking across the stage. but if you say, okay, I saw Rich and he was walking, I saw him there at Living Hope Church in the chapel, and he was walking west, so what was he doing? He must be walking to California. Right? Why do you believe? Well, I saw him take 4 or 5 steps, and they were all headed west. So logically, he was headed to California. Well, no, I was walking across the stage. And I'm using this as a metaphor, right? What we see are these little variations equivalent to walking across the stage. Changes within types, changes within kinds, modifications of kinds. You even see things like certain species of fish over hundreds, thousands of years living in caves, living in dark environments. It's not uncommon for them to have eyes, but they're blind, right? You see that in nature. What you see is a loss of function, right? The selection pressures no longer favor vision, or visual information, and so that modality can be taken offline, and it doesn't affect the survival and the reproduction and the fitness of the organism. You see a loss of function, but you don't see it in the other direction. You don't see a gaining of some major function like that evidenced in the scientific record. So again, evidence, tiny little slither, and then this huge extrapolation. And the extrapolation, again, is based upon their meta-narrative. They're invested in this idea that everything came from a common ancestor, life came from non-life, over billions of years. You get multicellular life, and then all of the varieties that you see today. One of the things, and this isn't on my notes, this is free, I won't charge you for this, but to me, I remember when I first started questioning evolutionary theory, and one of the things that really stuck out in my mind was, why is there so much variety? You can almost get if you listen to the evolutionists long enough, you can almost kind of grant them enough assumptions. I'm not saying you should do this. You're certainly not compelled by the scientific evidence. But let's just say you're being very generous. You can almost imagine how maybe like some little half-alive, very simple, non-sophisticated, microscopic life form could come into existence over billions of years. But the kinds of variety that we have today, there's something like 300,000 different species of beetles, right? It just blows your mind. The enormous complexity, the variety, the richness of life. Why in the world, if there's no creator, if there's no purpose, we're here on this little rock that got bombarded by comets to bring it oceans, would you expect to see the types of variety of life that you witness when you go on a walk through nature? Again, I wouldn't offer that as one of my main proofs, but it did kind of make me suspicious. I remember thinking, looks like something else is going on. It almost seems like there is some higher power. I wasn't to God yet. I certainly wasn't to Yahweh yet, or Jehovah. But it seems like there must be some type of higher power that really likes variety and intentionally brought that out through the created order. To me, I believe that's a more proper assumption based upon the available evidence than saying, no, it's just nature. Blind nature happening through physical processes over eons of time. All right, so I think in your notes it should say something about the tree of life, the Darwinist or the evolutionist tree of life versus the creationist orchard of life. Is that in there?
Yes.
That's what this slide is depicting, the orchard of life. So rather than a single tree that starts with a universal common ancestor, some microscopic organism in the ocean billions of years ago, everything comes from that. What is this depicting? This is depicting a creationist model. If you visit, for example, Ken Ham's museum, the Answers in Genesis Museum up in Petersburg, Kentucky, you'll see these types of diagrams and these types of graphs. This is consistent with Genesis, both the original creation and God reissuing the decree to animals after the flood to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. Okay? So, which one do we want to go with? Birds, for example. Well, maybe birds isn't a good example. You have, again, kind of our dogs here on the left. There was an original kind of animal, canine kind, that was created. And then you have speciation, you have some branching. That's what these branches represent. They don't all stay exactly alike. They kind of branch out into considerable variety. Okay? What do you think those blue lines represent?
Flood?
The flood. Yeah, the Noahic flood. Okay? Well, that's why you see only one little line there. There's one, well, two, but one kind of dog that's represented on the ark. And from those, immediately after the flood, when the ark lands on Mount Ararat, those animals are released back out of the wild. It's just very rapid. I think God facilitated this. I think this is my own personal belief. You know, you don't have to buy it if you don't want to. But I think I have every reason to believe, based upon Scripture, that God accelerated this process because He's redistributing animals around the globe in a really short amount of time. And so God interacts with the genome to bring out this rich variety, to repopulate the kinds. And so you see this explosion here, these almost completely horizontal lines right after the flood, and then you see some progression from those, maybe a few more branches, okay? Tweaking animals to their environments. And so this would represent an orchard rather than a big bush or a big tree of evolution. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah.
So there were dinosaurs on the ark?
I think there were, yeah. I think there were. They would have not been real big dinosaurs, right? One of the things you got to remember is before the flood, animals lived, not just humans, but animals lived a long time. And if my knowledge of reptiles serves me correctly, reptiles continue to grow throughout their lifespan. They're not like us. We reach basically our adult size, at least height-wise, right? Not so much this way, but this way when we're 16, 17, 18 years of age. Well, the reptiles, or at least most reptile species, keep on growing. So what do you do with what's a reptile going to look like that's 1,000 years old? Like if you had a salamander, it started out this big, first year, second year like this, third year like that. Well, time that, I was going to say that, well, time that thing gets, that beast, gets to be 300 years old, 500 years old, 1,000 years old, it's going to be a pretty sizable animal. And so that's at least one theory about the dinosaurs. But there's nothing that prevented dinosaurs from being on the ark. Most dinosaurs were not like Stegosaurus size or T-Rex size, right? There were a lot of little dinosaurs. Even if you go to a natural history museum, based upon completely non-theistic evolutionary assumptions, you'll see a lot of small dinosaurs too. Smaller than maybe the size of your dog or slightly bigger. Okay. Another thing too is juveniles. Right? Juveniles, in all likelihood, Noah would have wisely, the Bible actually says God directed the animals to the ark. Noah, I guess, loaded them on, but they came to him. Well, I imagine the ones, you didn't take a full-size giraffe, you would have taken a kind of a smaller one, right? You wouldn't why take a full-size one? It's just more food and everything else you have to take care of for that lengthy period of time. Yes?
Just curious your opinion. What's your opinion on the dinosaurs being wiped out?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a good theory on why they got wiped out. Competition for resources, I guess, would be one of the most plausible alternatives. I've seen some models that would maintain that pretty much the entire globe would have been what we would regard as subtropical climate prior to the flood. Especially the models that employ like a vapor canopy. I don't know if you've seen those. And you know, the main source of the floodwaters wasn't rain. It would have been underwater, underground reservoirs, huge reservoirs of water that came up. The fountains of the deep, the Bible talks about, right? Well, those came from the ground up. And the models will sometimes say, too, that the vapor canopy, there was a vapor canopy that warded off a lot of the UV radiation. That's one of the reasons why animals live longer, much longer before the flood than after the flood. And that condensed during the flood, and most of the rain that came from the sky came from a condensation of that vapor canopy. Now, after that vapor canopy was no longer there, you got the radical climates that we see today. And in fact, the flood models would predict that within about several decades to 100 or 200 years after the flood, you would have had a major ice age. And of course, we see evidence of that today. The secular geologist would say, well, no, that was 10,000 years ago. Some of them say we're still kind of coming out of the last ice age. Well, maybe we did. We don't really disagree about the ice age, but we disagree about what caused it and when exactly it was. Even though this would be one of the estimates that we would roughly agree upon, several thousand years ago there was an ice age. Right? And so those changes would have limited the available biosphere in which dinosaurs could thrive, and maybe that was one of the factors that led to their extinction. Yes?
In this explanation, if dinosaurs were living at the same time as early humans after the ark, why don't we have any written records that there were dinosaurs alive at the same time? We don't see anywhere.
Yeah, we do. We actually have those. I mean, if you want to get with me, I can provide you some links you can check into on your own. Both written records and in-print records. But the word dinosaur, obviously, people weren't talking about dinosaurs thousands of years ago. Why not? Because they didn't have a word for dinosaur. We have good reason to believe that the word dragon, or the depictions of dragons that you see from all around the world, are traced back to the coexistence of humans with these terrible lizards that we today would call dinosaurs. Okay, the book of Job, if you look at Job 40 and 41, look at that when you get home, Old Testament, book of Job, and you'll see two different animals described there in great detail. One's called Behemoth, and the other's called Leviathan. And if you read those descriptions of Behemoth and Leviathan, it's hard to suggest anything other than what we would call a dinosaur today. And obviously Job is writing about, or the writer of Job is writing about animals that he expected everybody to kind of know what this thing is. He wasn't describing it like this mythological beast. He's just giving it a description and assuming that the reader is going to know exactly what he's talking about.
And that's the oldest book of the Bible.
Yeah. Right. It would have, so before Moses, right? So, yeah. All right, so moving forward here, I want to get into this topic. Why the Darwinian takeover? Right? Okay, how and when and where and why did that happen? I'm sure that could be a whole course, right? You could get your master's in history writing on that particular topic. So what I'm going to do is restrict my analysis very narrowly, and I want to talk about one particular landmark case. 1925, right up the road in Dayton, Tennessee. Anybody been to Dayton, Tennessee before? Not too far away, a couple hours away, right?
Nice little college there.
Yeah. So the court case was called the Scopes Monkey Trial. It came to be known as the Scopes Monkey Trial. That wasn't the original name. They're like, let's have the Scopes Monkey Trial, right? That was the name given to it actually by a fellow named H.L. Mencken. Have you heard of Mencken before? Famous writer, journalist back in the early part of the 20th century, based out of Boston. As we're going to see, Mencken was a a radical atheist, very anti-Christian guy. He was there for the Scopes Monkey trial. He was pro-Nazi. He was anti-Semite. He was an anti-Semite. Okay, and he's going to have a lot to do with how the case of the Scopes Monkey trial got portrayed to the American public the way that it did, how it got sold to them. And what we're going to see is a big, major case of fake news. Okay? Fake news is not new. Fake news dates back at least to the Garden of Eden, right? To the lie of the devil. And so we're going to see fake news here being a major factor in the Scopes Monkey trial. All right, so again, 1925, Dayton, Tennessee. The Scopes Monkey trial I'm going to give you a little history here. I had a bunch of slides with a bunch of words, and I'm like, that's way too verbose. Let me just try to give you the highlights. Charles Darwin's book came out in 1859. So we're talking about several decades after the ideas were published of Darwin. Most American states had laws on their law books that forbade not the teaching of evolution. Pretty much all the states said you can teach evolution, you can teach Darwin's ideas, you can teach speciation, you can teach old Earth. They didn't really have a problem with that, but they said they forbade specifically the teaching that humans evolved from some type of primate ancestor. Okay? Basically, we came from some sort of ape-like or monkey-like creature. So that was the only restriction that was on the law book. And I'm blanking on the name for it. Tennessee had a specific name for that law, and it varied from state to state. But the ACLU, you guys have heard of our good friends at the ACLU before, right? The American Civil Liberties Union, or the Anti-Christian League of... Traditionally, they're not a big fan of evangelical Christians, and this dates back at least to Scopes. The ACLU took out ads in papers, newspapers. This is how people communicated. They didn't post stuff on Facebook, right? So they took out ads in newspapers, and it was like the Chattanooga Times had an ad in the back of it, and what they were doing is they were fishing for a teacher, a public school teacher, who had encountered some type of opposition to, a public school teacher who was willing to come forth and admit that he or she taught common descent, that humans evolved from an ape-like ancestor. So they put that out there. And so the townspeople of Dayton, Tennessee, their economy, I understand, was reeling. They were having a real hard time. I'm not a historian, this would have been close to the Great Depression, right? 1925, kind of like the preface to the Great Depression. So their economy is reeling, and they get together. The place, people didn't used to come to Starbucks and hang out. They would go to the city drugstore. And I guess the drugstores had fountains. You could buy a cola there. That's the whole history of Coca-Cola, by the way, different topic for a different time. But they would hang out, they would talk, they would have some sodas, and they said, hey guys, we need to revitalize our economy. You know one great way to do it? I bet the whole nation and the media would descend upon Dayton, Tennessee and infuse our economy with all kinds of money if we had a teacher that would come forth and admit to teaching evolution. All we'd have to do is call up the ACLU, they'll send their best lawyers, it'll attract all kinds of media attention. And so what they did is they got John T. Scopes. John T. Scopes was a science teacher. He was never a biology teacher. He taught earth sciences. He was the football coach the year before. The town really liked John T. Scopes. This is one of the big differences you'll see between Inherit the Wind and what actually happened. John T. Scopes was very well liked before the trial, during the trial, and after the trial by the townspeople of Dayton, Tennessee. They were enthusiastically behind John T. Scopes. You're going to see something very different from that in the clip I'll show you from Inherit the Wind. And so they bring in John T. Scopes and they say, hey John, did you teach evolution those last 2 weeks that you filled in for the sick biology teacher? And he said, no, I don't think I did. But I think I saw some pictures in the book that we used that taught Darwinian ideas. And they're like, well, bring in the book, let's take a look at it. Sure enough, they bring in the book and they start flipping through the pages, and right there they have a diagram of the supposed common ancestry between humans and apes. And they're like, bingo, John, all you got to do is say that you covered this in class, or you think maybe you covered this in class, and we'll have you arrested. Right? He was arrested, by the way. They never handcuffed him. They never put him in jail. If you watch Inherit the Wind, you'll see John T. Scopes in jail multiple times. He's never in jail, never even cuffed, never really arrested. It was just one of those arrests that was kind of like a token arrest. The police and John T. Scopes were on the same side of this whole thing. They weren't trying to persecute him. They wanted the media attention. So they bring charges against John T. Scopes deliberately. He knows that they're going to. John T. Scopes coaches the students that testify in the case to make accusations against him, not to try to minimize their accusations, but to actually amplify their accusations. He goes on record as saying, hey guys, I'm worried about this. I don't want to perjure myself because I didn't really even teach any of this stuff. And they're kind of like, that doesn't matter. Come on, John, just roll with it. You know, we're trying to get media attention here. The ACLU sends from Boston a fellow by the name of Clarence Darrow. You heard of that name before? Hotshot criminal defense attorney, considered at the time to be the most ambitious, the most rhetorically gifted lawyer in all of the United States. He was a very bright guy. Darrow identifies as an agnostic. He's very rabid anti-Christian. He's very anti-fundamentalist. That word fundamentalist and the negative connotations that came to bear upon the church dates back to Clarence Darrow in the Scopes Monkey trial. The defense, sorry, no, that was the defense. I got that backwards. Darrow was for the defense. Williams Jennings Bryant was a multiple-time unsuccessful campaigner for the presidency, right? And he was kind of the leader of the evangelical movement at the time. He himself a brilliant lawyer. And so what happens, just as predicted, you have these national celebrities meet up for this showdown in Podunk, Dayton, Tennessee, right? And literally thousands of media reporters, not just from across America. This was 1925, from England, from the UK, come and they descend upon Dayton, Tennessee. The telecast is live. Obviously, they didn't have TV back in the day. It was the first live radio broadcast around the nation of any type of court proceedings. So there's a historical merit here. All of America's tuned in. They didn't have a lot to do back in those days, you know. So they tuned in to the Scopes Monkey trial. And so, long story short, you know, Dayton, Tennessee gets exactly what it wanted. It gets put on the map. It gets all kinds of revenues. All of a sudden, they're celebrities. And just wrapping up what happened, it's the middle of the summer, sweltering heat, 90 plus degrees every day. That's outside of the courtroom. Inside of the courtroom, who knows how hot it was. You have this showdown, this rhetorical showdown between Darrow and Williams Jennings Bryant. They kind of are mostly taking jabs at each other. They discuss basically no Darwinian evolution. That really isn't factored in at all. Several days in, John T. Scopes changes his plea from not guilty to guilty. Of course, he's found guilty and he's fined $100. The ACLU covers the costs, right? And everybody goes home. Right? That's sort of like the end of the story. And so he was found guilty. Again, he's fined $100, no jail time, nothing like that. He was well-liked before, during, and after. And then several years later, you get the Hollywood version. You get the fake news media version of what happened in the Scopes Monkey trial. And I encourage you to watch this because it's a great example of propaganda. It's a great example of anti-Christian propaganda. I'm going to show you a clip here, if it loads, hopefully it will, from the original movie, 1960. And it was based upon a play that had been circulated for a decade or so prior to that. there was a remake of this movie, I think it was in like 2000 and, somebody help me out, like 2008. It wasn't that long ago. If you're going to watch it, watch the 1960 version. They actually have better actors back then than they do today. But it's called Inherit the Wind. You can stream it on YouTube. And I want to show you here how they depict the townspeople of Dayton, Tennessee during the events of the trial. All right.
Very well. You can make arrangements with the court clerk. Who are you? My name is John Stebbins. Court will adjourn and reconvene at 10 a.m. tomorrow.
They changed the name here, and I forget the name of the movie. They don't call him John T. Scopes, but what they're doing here, the angry mob is wanting Scopes to be hanged and burned at the stake for teaching evolution.
She can sleep all right tonight. Give her these pills tomorrow and keep her in bed. Thank you, John. Rachel. Rachel.
So, of course, that was supposed to be Scopes there in prison, waiting his fate, right? You have the angry Christian mob outside that wants him to get burned at the stake and hang from the tree. None of that happened. But see, people, again, fake news. It's the same thing that we see happening left and right today. It's out there in the media, people watch the movie, they don't get the actual facts, and they assume that's what really happened. That's not at all what happened. But see, what it did, it was a big part of turning the tide in this whole evolution versus creation debate, controversy, dialogue, strongly against the Bible-believing Christians. They're the angry mob. They're out for blood. They don't want to hear facts. They don't want to hear reason. They just want to hang somebody. They just want to burn somebody. Not at all. I mean, completely different story from what actually took place. Okay, so I encourage you to take a look at that when you get some time. It's worth, just for the historical information, the value of that. And also in your own discussions with people, you can use it as a great example. I'm not sure what this thing's doing here. Okay, snooze. Hopefully that didn't mess anything up. All right, so the aftermath of this, H.L. Mencken's trial reports were heavily slanted against the prosecution and the jury. Why? Because he was a militant anti-Christian atheist, which were unanimously hot for Genesis. He mocked the town's inhabitants as yokels and morons. He called William Jennings Bryan, a buffoon in his speeches theological bilge. In contrast, he called the defense eloquent and magnificent. He was on the defense. Right? He was the primary spokesperson for the defense. Even today, some American creationists fighting in courts and state legislators to demand that creationism be taught on an equal footing with evolution in the schools have claimed that it was Mencken's trial reports in 1925 that turned public opinion against creationism. Well, that's because that's largely what happened. Okay? Now, I'm not saying that's the only thing that happened. That was a big deal. It was a major factor. The media's portrayal of Darrow's cross-eyed examination of Bryan and the play and the movie Inherit the Wind, what we just saw the clip from, 1960, caused millions of Americans to ridicule religious-based opposition to the theory of evolution. You see what's happening there? This is supposed to be a discourse about facts. It's supposed to be a discourse about scientific evidence, being objective, being reasonable, using logic and the empirical method to weigh out data and to see which model better fits the data. And it's not about that. It becomes about media spin. It becomes about fake news. And meanwhile, the legitimate discussions gets more and more marginalized. It gets more and more peripheralized. A little bit more about H.L. Mencken. He was a fanboy of Friedrich Nietzsche. Does that name ring a bell to anybody? Friedrich Nietzsche. Famous words of Friedrich Nietzsche. Someone help me. God is dead. We have killed him. Right? Atheist philosopher, had a huge impact on Adolf Hitler. As it turns out, he was a nihilist. He said that since God is dead and we have killed him, human society is not ready to live without God, which he got that part right. And he said, what we'll have to do, since there is no God, and since people are going to disbelieve in God now, is we've got to create the Superman. He didn't mean the guy flying through the sky with a cape. He meant a super race of humans. Right? Somebody help me who knows German. Übermensch, is that the word? Superman, the Übermensch. And the way we're going to do this is through basically engineering people, the selective breeding of people. Well, that sounds a whole lot like what the agenda of Adolf Hitler was. In fact, what Hitler did more than anything else is he married the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche to the quote-unquote science of Charles Darwin. That's where you got the Holocaust. I mean, I know there was other factors involved, but really that was the ideological machinery behind the Holocaust. He was a big fanboy of Thomas Huxley. We talked about Huxley before. Huxley's nickname is Darwin's Bulldog. Charles Darwin, by all accounts, was a pretty timid guy. He wasn't a person to really... He could write kind of boldly, but he was sort of not very courageous, not well-spoken in person. Huxley was the steam engine behind disseminating Darwin's ideas to the public. And so he's known as Charles Darwin's Bulldog. I have some quotes for you that you'll find fascinating from both Darwin and Huxley next week. He was a fan of Nazism. He was very pro-Nazi. Now, he was American citizen, based out of Boston. 1925, very pro-Nazi. He hated democracy. He wrote rapidly against the democratic process. He considered the average person to be too stupid and not evolutionarily advanced enough to be able to cast a ballot with any degree of authority or certainty. Rabid anti-Semitism. Of course, he didn't write that in the papers. That was more of his private correspondence, but it's very clear that he hates Jews. And he was militantly anti-Christian. But he is the primary reason why the Scopes monkey trial, the trajectory of that, had a very anti-Christian slant to it, okay? Any questions about that? I've got 7:43. Let me introduce a couple of things here about Darwinism, and then take some questions. How Darwinism fails. Well, there's a big difference between what Darwinism claims and what it delivers. Again, the claim is a comprehensive naturalistic account of all of life. That's what you're supposed to believe, unquestioningly. That's what you're supposed to accept as this robust mountain of incontrovertible data behind it. And if you're just scientifically educated, you're going to endorse this theory. That's what it asks of you. What it delivers is a little bit of data, and then these wild extrapolations, these wild speculations of what must have happened, these retroactive just so stories. This is the way it must have been. Why? Because this is what fits our theory. And so it lets the idea, the narrative, the presupposition, the assumption drive the interpretation of the data rather than the way it's supposed to work the other way around. Okay? Well, let's hear from our good old friend Richard Dawkins again, since we've got a few minutes.
Rich, hold the mic up to your computer when you do that.
Okay. just a little bit of background here.
Hello, Professor Dawkins. How are you?
While this is loading. It's from Ben Stein's movie Expelled. Have any of y'all seen it? You can watch it online. Again, I highly recommend this. And what it does is it reveals the rabid bias against anything that smacks of intelligent design in higher education. Okay, just how much bias, how many careers have been just completely derailed because of some vague indication that a researcher who wasn't even a Christian, and this is not even really a religious person, just a person who says, well, maybe we should kind of like consider the possibility that intelligent design has some merit, okay? And so in this clip that I want you to see, Ben Stein meets up with Richard Dawkins, and it's really interesting to me how Richard Dawkins speculates. See if you can notice any wild speculations of sort of the atheist extraordinaire, Richard Dawkins, when it comes to the idea of how life came from non-life.
From primitive superstition.
So religion is a primitive
Oh,
superstition.
I think it is, yes.
So you believe it's liberating to tell people that there is no God?
I think a lot of people, when they give up God, feel a great sense of release
It's West.
and freedom.
West.
Why do you think that? I mean, what's your dad? You're a scientist. What's your dad?
I think, well, I had a lot of letters saying that, and I
There are 8 billion people in the world.
Yeah,
Dr. Dawkins. How many letters have you
No,
had?
I haven't done that quite true.
Professor Dawkins seemed so convinced that God doesn't exist that I wondered if he would be willing to put a number on it.
Well, it's hard to put a figure on it, but I mean, I put it as something like 99% against or something.
Well, I don't know it's 99%,
I
I'm
don't.
saying 97.
No, I did. You asked me to put a figure on it, and I'm not comfortable putting a figure on it. I think I just think it's very unlikely.
What? But you couldn't put a number on it.
No, of course not.
So it could be 49%.
Well, it would be. I mean, I think it's unlikely, but and it's quite far from 50%.
How do you know?
I don't know. I mean, I put an argument in the book.
Well, then who did create the heavens and the earth?
Why do you use the word who? You see, you immediately beg the question by using the word who.
Well, then how did it get created?
Well, by a very slow process.
Well, how did it start?
Nobody knows how it started. We know the kind of event that it must have been. We know the sort of event that must have happened for the origin of life.
What was that?
It was the origin of the first self-replicating molecule.
Right, how did that happen?
I've told you we don't know.
So you have no idea how it started?
No, nor has anyone.
Nor has anyone else. What do you think is the possibility that
He has no idea, but it's not God. Definitely not God.
intelligent design might turn out to be the answer to some issues in genetics or in evolution?
It could come about in the following way. It could be that at some earlier time, somewhere in the universe, a civilization evolved by probably some kind of Darwinian means to a very, very high level of technology and designed a form of life that they seeded onto perhaps this planet. Now, that is a possibility and an intriguing possibility. And I suppose it's possible that you might find evidence for that if you look at the details of biochemistry, molecular biology. You might find a signature of some sort of designer.
Wait a second. Richard Dawkins thought intelligent design might be a legitimate pursuit?
And that designer could well be a higher intelligence from elsewhere in the universe.
So my video, I was showing video here. It's one of I'm getting used to this technology. You guys just saw the picture. I didn't realize till the end. But what it really is, isn't it interesting that he speculates? And what Dawkins will espouse is what's called panspermia. That's kind of the theory that some sort of ancient alien civilization seeded planets like Earth with life, and that's where these molecules that originally formed the basis of common ancestry came alive. Well, why does he do that? I think well, first of all, he's just backing up the issue of design, but it's to get around the obvious tendency to look at the enormous complexity in nature and draw the inference of design. You see, he resorts to all kinds of crazy, clearly unscientific conjecture to get around the problem. He's willing to entertain any idea, any speculation. The only thing he won't entertain is the idea that God may have been involved. Did you see that? Did you see how that took place there? And he's one of many scientists today. It's kind of a little bit of a difference. This is more like cosmology, but says, well, you know, the universe that we observe is it's so clearly manifest fine-tuning that it must be a simulation. This is one of the recent theories. I'm not talking about like people who read too many comic books and smoke a bunch of weed and stay up late at night talking about crazy ideas in their dorm room. I'm talking about legitimate scientists, theoretical physicists, people with PhDs who publish lots of papers, and they say, well, it looks really, really designed, so it must be a simulation. Why do you think it's a simulation? Because, look, these parameters are just too finely tuned. There's no way that could happen by chance, so some sort of alien intelligence, our present universe is just a simulation. Again, what they'll do is they'll entertain any idea except for God. God's out of the question. Why? Because their presupposition insists that God not be considered. Right? And so I think you see how it took place there. All right. Let's back to the slideshow real quick.
You could even ask them where the aliens came from.
Yeah.
You know, like,
Well, yeah, so at best, they're just backing up the question. So that's it. All right, well, it's going to work. Okay, so major scientific... I can't get these to cooperate. I have a different screen than you guys do. All right, let's catch up here. Major scientific challenges for Darwinism. Abiogenesis, genetic entropy, the fossil record. This is really the meat of the lecture. I know I'm long-winded. I should have gotten here about this point last week. I want to at least introduce one before we break. So let's just launch into this real quick. I won't go into a lot of detail. Abiogenesis, life coming from non-life. It had to happen. Okay? Obviously, we have living organisms today. And so the possibilities are the organisms were somehow intelligently designed, created by some sort of creator who was not himself part of the system, or nature itself somehow performed this miracle, given enough time, given enough permutations, given enough opportunities, it was bound to happen, and it did. Okay? Obviously, the Bible takes a position on this. Genesis 1, 20, verse 24, God said, let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures. God speaks to the ocean. Life comes out of the ocean. Right? How did that happen mechanistically? I don't know. Right? But God's word did it. Let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens. And God said, let the earth, he speaks to the earth now, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds. God empowers the earth to produce life. Livestock and creeping things and beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and it was so. So the Bible answers the question. The question for the scientist, the question for the naturalist is, we would say we take that on faith. Question for the naturalist is, what do you got? What do you bring to the table? Why should I believe? You're saying science. You're saying that this is a scientifically informed position. It's not faith. Okay, well, show me a good working model of how life can come from non-living materials. How you're not accepting that on faith, you're taking it on the merits of the scientific evidence. Okay, great question to ask them. See what they can do with it. So much of apologetics is turning the table. And I'm not talking about being duplicitous. I'm not talking about being crafty. But people are allowed to ask us questions about our faith, and we should be ready to answer them. It's really amazing to me, though, when you turn the tables, and you say, okay, so this is your position. How do you explain that? How do you account for that? You claim this is science? Well, show me the scientific evidence that would compel me to agree with you. How woefully few people have anything to offer when you put them on the spot. You're supposed to answer all of their questions, but they're basically want to put themselves in a position where you're constantly on the defensive and they're constantly on the offensive. Well, don't stay there. I mean, play both sides, Play some defense, but play some offense as well. So you have a worldview, here's what it presupposes, here's what it assumes. Talk to me about that. Tell me how that happened. And don't just tell me there's a bunch of fossils, you got to be more specific, okay? Because I know there are fossils too. Different people look at the same fossils and they come away with different conclusions. So explain to me how the fossils affirm your theory but not mine, how they're consistent with yours but not with mine. It's amazing how much mileage you can get out of that, okay? For time's sake, I'm going to stop there. We'll do a few questions before we leave. And I'll be around one more week. We'll get through the evolution. I'm assuming Pastor David doesn't want to teach a whole lot of the science stuff.
No.
He's going to speak from his area of expertise and cover topics like the Trinity and the deity of Christ. If you don't think those are important, you haven't talked to people on college campus for a while. This stuff, what we're doing tonight is not more important than that. It really isn't. Deity of Christ, the Trinity comes up all the time in public evangelism and public apologetics. So what questions do you guys have? Yes?
I just was wondering if you have a good book that I can read about the Scopes trial. If if not, I can email you if you don't have it.
Yeah, let me look into it. But go ahead and email me, and I'll look into it. I didn't get the information from the book. I went and watched the movies,
Okay.
and then I started doing some research on Mencken. Yeah. So, but I'm sure there's something written, so I'll find something. Yes, sir.
So in the evolutionary model, what happened to man? I mean, he has not evolved. He has devolved.
Yeah, and right. So we're going to look at that with genetic entropy. So that's a really good point you bring up, Lucius. I mean, that's what we see. The data actually shows something called genetic entropy. They saw what we see is an accumulation of disease. We see a wearing down. And people are living longer in Western societies, but why is that? Improved diet, improved medical science, improved technology. But what we see commensurate with that is actually people are becoming less and less healthy. They're just surviving longer in unhealthy conditions. All right, so what actually we see genetically is more appropriately what we might call devolution rather than evolution. Now, the evolutionist is not going to say that. They're going to say, of course we're evolving. Don't you know we have vestigial organs, the molar teeth, the appendix, they'll try to tell you that you have a tail. You have a tail, when you're an embryo. All of those things have been answered, by the way. None of them hold any water. But they would say that we are, every living animal today, including ourselves, is a transitional. Why do they say that? Because of the evidence? No. They say it again because of their narrative, because of the model that they're committed to. Yeah. One more. No? Going once?
What's the hardest question you're asked on the college campus?
The hardest? Well, you know the answer to that. You said in your sermon on Sunday. No, I really do. I think the problem of evil, the problem of pain and suffering, especially when people make it specific, I can give you good theological answers to it. When you say, why did these particular 18 kids die last week in the shooting? I mean, I got nothing. I got theological answers. I kind of can tell you why we live in that kind of world. But why one child dies of brain cancer rather than another? Why did God not stop the Holocaust after 1,000 Jews were killed? Why did he let 6 million of them be killed? I don't know. I can't answer that.
All right. We're going to take an offering for Rich and his ministry. He's support-based. If you don't know what that means, it means that individuals personally support his ministry, and that's what helps him survive, put food on the table, kids' health issues, right, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, he could use more support monthly, and as the baskets are passed in a minute, if you didn't get it last week, there's a little flyer that gives information if you're interested in supporting his ministry monthly, or even have that information available if you feel led to give after tonight. But we do want to take an offering tonight. If you need a tax receipt for your gift, then you have to give to Truth on Display. Okay, so if you write a check, it'd be Truth on Display. If that doesn't matter to you, it's more beneficial to him if you just make a check out to Rich Suplita.
Actually, it'd be like TSCO.
TSCM.
For Tom Short Campus Ministry.
Oh, Tom Short Campus Ministry. Sorry about that. Tom Short Campus Ministry. The web address for that ministry is on that flyer. So if you want to give electronically, you can go there and you scroll down to the intern, give to the intern program. Then you can specify specifically Rich Suplita. If you have any trouble with that, let us know. But if you want to give, but you're just not prepared to give tonight, and we're not going to pass the thing that you can slide your card on, then do it online through the information on that. So let me pray. Then we'll pass the basket. As we're doing that, I want you to tell about what you're doing this week at UGA.
Oh, yeah.
So, Father, we thank you. I ask you, God, to provide for all of Rich's ministry needs, his family, and thank you for his just blessing us tonight and through this class. So I pray that every person here will be led of your Spirit and how and when they give, and we trust you to be the provider in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, guys, so pass the baskets, and this will just take 1 minute, and then you can talk about that, and we'll be done.
Yeah, okay, so our Truth on Display project, we have displays. We go to college campuses, that's what we do. We try to go 3 consecutive days. Unfortunately, we're only at UGA tomorrow and Friday. We'll be set up in the Tate area. And we set up the banners. The banners have 3 themes. Day 1 is There is a God, evidence for God in creation. And one of the several banners that we put up has, for example, questions for the evolutionist, right? Going on the offensive, like I was talking about, making them explain their own case. Day 2 is, so there is a God, day 1. Day 2, the Bible is the Word of God. So we look at the history of Scripture, we look at how the Bible has been used to spearhead societal and social progress. We look at the scourge of secularism and how the Bible has been used to combat that. Anything from the abolition of slavery on up, the founding of the scientific method, universities, all of these are traceable to biblical thinking. Day 3 is only Jesus. Only Jesus can reconcile us to God. So there is a God, the Bible is the Word of God, Jesus is the only way to God. We set up the banners and the idea is dialogue. More than anything, we want to have questions and answers with people. That's what we want to do.
All right. So they'll be out there from noon until whenever. 4-ish, 5-ish, if you wanted to make your way to Tate tomorrow or Friday and check them out. It's really cool to see. So thanks for coming. Finish up Evolution next week. And then Trinity and the deity of Christ after that, and then you'll be back for the resurrection. Yes. All right. Good night. Thanks for coming.